Welcome, Brooke. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and I'm glad that we can make this work. I know last time I had power issues because I'm in Zambia, so that seems to be the story of the nation lately.
All good. Well, we can. Before we came on, we were chatting, and look, if the power goes out, so be it. That's life, isn't it? We'll all just roll with it.
Absolutely. That's all we can do is dance with life.
Exactly. Lovely to have you. Looking forward to hearing some of your story.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm looking forward to just chatting and getting to know each other and talk about I think the many important issues that we need to be talking about in the world.
Indeed. Yes, we have. I think quite a lot of commonalities in the ways we see the world and the roles of business. I first came across your work and thinking through a friend who connected me and did a little comment on LinkedIn to one of your posts. And I was like, ah, you're singing from the same song sheet as me around all of these aspects of the beautiful opportunities and the role that business can play and that we as leaders can have in terms of shaping and changing and ultimately leaving the world better than we found it, rather than seeing business just as a bit of a money making zero sum game where someone else has to lose for us to win. So I'm thrilled to learn more about your work. And I'll get you in a moment to give us a little bit of some of the evolution of that work. But for those who aren't familiar with Brooke, she's the CEO of Makor Resources and the host of the Take Two podcast. And really, some of the aspects that we're going to talk through today are around how we become more conscious on how we consume, how we manufacture, how we source, but trying to hear from Brooke some of the personal stories and examples of what that can actually look like, in action. So, Brooke, to kick us off, I'm wondering if you can just tell us kind of the cliff notes, the high level version of what the evolution of your work and passion has been in this area.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it started many years ago. I think I also shared a post on this as well. I used to model, and it was just more of it just happened by accident. I was living in Boston. I grew up a Boston bred girl, Harvard Crimson at heart, and I was going in and out of New York City on quite a regular basis for various different shoots and runway shows. And I was actually at a shoot for Stella McCartney, of all designers. And that was my first interaction with somebody that was doing something in a very conscious way. And I was young, I mean, I was under 16 years old, and it was during a time where that hadn't even really become a conversation yet. It was not mainstream at all. And what was so impressive is that backstage, they started educating us on her work and what it meant to create a responsible fashion line, especially in textile space, and some of the challenges that emerged around that space. And of course, again, very young, so new to this, but I think it sparked something. It's not like I can say, hey, it led me down this pathway and I had this epiphany. But I look back and it sparked something in such a way that as I looked at the trajectory of my career thereafter, everything was somewhat interconnected. I think, if somebody looks at my profile, often they'll say to me, oh, you look so diverse, but actually everything was very intentional. And I think that it was all interconnected. I've done a lot of work in the celebrity space and in the media space for a long time. And what people don't know is behind the scenes, when I was working with these various names to either get them on covers or get them into different publications or to get them featured on different podcasts, it was always because I was looking to connect their message in a very purposeful way out in the world. So it was, how can you use your impact or your influence to create broader impact? So that was kind of my driving force. My partner Rickis, he has been in the industry for a very long time. He's an Australian citizen. You might know him. Worked for the big names, BHP and South 32. And when you are with somebody in mining, you learn mining very quickly and you spend the time traveling the world. And we made a very conscious effort to do a lot of work together. I was working far more on the community development side at that point and supporting marketing initiatives for various different mining companies and houses from tier one to small and mid cap. And we realized that there was a massive gap that existed in the industry. And there was a long way for the industry to go to really be responsible producers, to really work with communities in a way that made a profound difference. At the end of the day, the world needs mining, but mining depends on communities, and you have to get that right. And so that became our mission. And we created a company called Makor Resources. And it is about providing mining as a service, not only to the world, but to all the artisanal and small scale miners that are typically that underserved subset of the sector. And we work with them to get capital, to formalize, to get licensed, to then get access to markets. And that's where the Mine to Main Street came from, is not just connecting the artisanal small scale miners with Main Street audiences, but connecting Main Street audiences in a very conscious way to where their products come from that they interact with and use on a day-to-day basis.
Right there at the end, and that idea of the consciousness and being aware of how these things connect into a bigger system takes you full circle back to that Stella McCartney kind of conversation of, as a young person, realizing, oh, there's actually a story behind this, and there's clarity around what's driving this business and how they make decisions. And I think many of those aspects that you touched on there are really interesting because they do cover some different, what would be seen. You said people often say, oh, like there's a bit of a random mix to the industries and the work that you've done. But I think there's an emerging understanding that brand, our positioning, how we differentiate from the competition is so much more powerful if it is done from a place of genuine uh, sharing what really matters, not just what we think we should say. And I would love to hear, in terms of when you talked about this work of Mine to Main Street and tapping into artisans and not just the big mining companies, but down into the smaller kind of contributors to that system. Where have you seen some of these examples where getting clear and being able to differentiate a company by things like being able to talk to proving where their products come from, or, what does the work that you're doing, how are businesses actually performing better and getting a competitive advantage through this type of approach to positioning and marketing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. So I would say, looking specifically at the sector, I think that there has been a big drive. And I think it started, to be honest with you, as a marketing tactic many, many years ago. And I think that it's evolved quite beautifully in time. It's become demanded by consumers. It's been demanded by the business world, by employees to be able to operate more responsibly. But at the end of the day, the sad reality of it is not where it needs to be and where it should be. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. Our whole focus is, and we work with large scale mining companies as well and partner with them because, especially in a lot of these vulnerable parts of the world, there is a very high probability that you are going to be operating within close proximity to an artisanal or small scale mine site. And traditionally, for so long, there has been this resistance to even go down that pathway because it is very complex. It is a very complex area to navigate. And so you just don't do it. And that was Rick's whole thing too. And we started with Makor. He had run large scale mining companies for years. I mean, 30 plus years. And it was, you just don't go down that pathway. But then what happens is you have things like human rights violations and child labor. And people often, they relate to it in a way that is like the industry is doing something wrong. But the reality of it is, gosh, I mean, child are just trying to survive, and women are just trying to survive, and people are doing it not to have any ill intentions, but because they just need to to put food on the table for the day, you know? And so we started to look at it from a dignity point of view initially, is like these people are just trying to get their fair share for what they're doing. And unfortunately, the world just was screwing them over. You know, they weren't getting paid what they should be getting paid for the gold that they were mining or the gemstones that they were mining. So we wanted to bring light to that by saying, let's ensure that everybody gets a fair share of the value chain. And acknowledged and paid, and let's address these human rights issues. And so that was really where it came from, is like, if I'm going to pick up my phone, you know, or I'm going to talk to you on this Zoom screen, or I'm going to wear a beautiful watch, where does this come from, and who are the hands that actually touched it to allow me to have these things? So that from a branding point of view and understanding the tone of voice, that's where it looks from. It's tying it back to really understanding the products that you interact with. But like I said, there is a long way to go, because we do have conversations, and I'll be very honest, on a regular basis with some of these tier one houses, and there is still a resistance to even address that sector or that part of the sector.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, there's always going to be um, a spectrum of who's engaging, what are their motivators, is that genuine? But I do love that you are taking both a pragmatic approach and also a deeply practical practitioner type piece of, you're not sitting disconnected in an office somewhere talking about something. You're really out there engaging with community, wanting to understand the context, because it's so important. I think one of the pieces that we'd had some interaction on LinkedIn around was, I've always loved the work of the late Pamela Hardigan when she used to talk about the need for us to apprentice with the problem. So, not just to see a problem and talk about it in a disconnected way, but get in there, get our hands dirty, understand what's happening. Um, have there been things where, as you've got more involved at the grassroots, where you've been getting your hands dirty, where some of your views and ideas have changed? I'm guessing that piece you just talked about is probably one of them, of starting to see why people might involve their children, for example, in work. But are there other examples where you now are starting to see this work in a different way because of the closeness to the proximity to community that you have?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's a number of things. You know, in the industry, we often hear about this social license to operate and protecting your license to operate. And I think what I've realized is how often people are engaging in CSR initiatives and community work, but just for that purpose. You know, that's become very, very clear, is there's still a lot of people that do that, which unfortunately, for me, it kind of, it looks at the work being done in communities as if it's inauthentic, because it's only to protect your license to operate. You know, it's like I hear a lot of people talking about it in that fashion. I would say that's one piece. The other thing is, gosh, I do so much work on the ground inside of communities, that became our core focus initially, was, okay, if we're going to build a gold mine, or we're going to continue working with large scale partners on the development of their copper assets, we need to get our communities right first and foremost. And so I've been heavily involved in Zambia. I mean, we moved here in June. And it's not just baseline assessments and socioeconomical surveying and reports that we're doing. That was a lot at the forefront, but that only informs so much. So then you have to get on the ground. You have to engage with people. And it's still astonishing to me the amount of people that get left behind. You know, we so often as an industry talk about the legacy that we're leaving, you know, leaving a positive legacy for our communities. I mean, I can't even tell you the amount of community members that I've seen that have been relocated due to environmental liabilities, and they've spent multiple generations on these farms, and they get relocated for less than $2,500. You know, it's like that's the value to their life and everything that they've built, and they don't have the same lot sizes, they don't get the same yields from their crops. And so, you know, that's something that I've also become very conscious of, is that we do a lot of talking in our reports about how great we are and all the community work that we're doing, but there's still a massive gap. And then I would say lastly, not lastly, but additionally, and maybe one of the biggest things, is we are so well intended in the work that we do, I think, as as private companies, as public companies with a social responsibility, as NGOs, as non-for-profits. But so many times I go into these communities for projects that have been implemented 3, 4 years ago, and something broke. The system broke. They're not sustainable. It's like these quick fixes, but these quick fixes, according to what we think as a Western world, are going to be the solution. And so often they're not the solution. And so it's really understanding at a systemic level with a very long dated outlook on something. How is this going to work? How can we sustain it? And I think there's also an opportunity there, and that's been a big learning for myself on the ground and the community work we're doing.
I could not agree more. I think in my work, particularly in Australia and then across the Pacific Islands, I've seen so many examples of that. And you're right, one of the challenges, if something only stays in the space of corporate social responsibility or any of those types of aspects around the license to operate, it's so risky because the moment something doesn't automatically or in a short time frame stack up financially, or it doesn't, it's no longer the focus of the next board meeting or the investors' quarterly expectations, it's hard to keep people engaging in meaningful ways. And that is really important in all of the work that I do with business leaders, is around trying to help them to see, if we instead really deeply understand and take responsibility for our own businesses, the decisions we do have control over, then we're not moving into that territory you just spoke about where we don't really understand the flow on effects or the unintended consequences. We don't have the time or expertise or commitment to really get in there and do what would be necessary to understand those things. So we're kind of dipping in and out. I would love to sit with some of those ideas that you speak a lot about related to those three areas of our role as consumers in the manufacturing or sort of supply chain side of things, and how we're sourcing, and look at those with you from that perspective of the business owner. So around the things we can control, or you and your partner in the changes, both in terms of where you live and the work that you're doing, has that been driven from a similar kind of journey to what I just described, of wanting to get in at a level you can have direct impact and understanding and control over? Has that been part of the motivator for you?
Yeah, it definitely has. Look, I mean, the reality of it is sometimes, and I've said this quite publicly, living in Zambia is difficult. I mean, I grew up in
Yeah.
the US, I've lived in London, we've lived in South Africa, Perth. And there's a lot of things that are very different to what I was, my context for growing up. And so it's very different, but we made a
Yeah.
very conscious choice to say, look, if we want to really understand on the ground who's involved in the supply chain, where the supply chain is breaking, create a connected supply chain, we need to be on the ground. Because if you're not on the ground, it's so easy for things to get misconstrued, for the wrong players to come into play. And the reality of it is there's still a lot of really bad players out there in the world, and people get taken advantage of all the time, and people get bribed all the time, with large scale companies,
Mm.
with small scale companies, with private companies. It's happening on a day-to-day basis. And so to take control of that, first and foremost, we knew we needed to be here. You can't build a mining company from an artisanal or small scale mine when we were living in Perth. There you just can't do that, especially if it's an African asset. It's very difficult. And I think that there's a level of relatability when it comes to our team here in Zambia as well, because they understand that we've committed to really creating this and building this with them, as opposed to flying in and flying out, because you get really disconnected to the realities. And so definitely, I would say that was the biggest driver to us moving here and being on the ground. And it's important to scale deep before you can scale wide, and that has really been our focus,
Yeah.
is let's really get this right here in Zambia, and then we can replicate that in other areas as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that, of what your actual ambitions are for scale and growth, because I would imagine that with the approach that you're taking, part of what will make the business model work will be, if it's at that smaller scale, you'll be needing numbers, like a lot of that work and those people that you're working with to be able to build that brand and reputation that you're after.
Yeah.
Is there, what's your kind of end goal, if you like? What would the dream be of what you build through demonstrating the trustworthiness, the fact that you can speak to traceability, all of those things?
Mm.
How are you building your business thinking about your own differentiation and how that will play out as an advantage for you over the years?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a maker really stands on three pillars: mining, marketing, and making, community making. And so it's about we becoming a world leader in responsible mining and delivering responsibly sourced materials to the world. That's number one. Number two is on the marketing side, is this is where Mine to Main Street comes from. It's tying, as I said earlier, not just where products come from to Main Street audiences and opening up markets to them, but I think it's even broader. It is really tying Main Street consumers and users to where their products come from. And I think the textile industry has done a phenomenal job of doing that. You're starting to see it a bit in the luxury jewelry space. But everybody else, there's a real disconnecting. Mining is really bad and they do all bad things. It's a lot of the terms that you hear, but yet they're still the first to pick up their phones, right? And so it's tying that narrative back. And then
Interesting.
most importantly, and really the foundation of it all is community making and addressing the very systemic issues in a very sustainable fashion. So that is, the foundation of Maker. By doing that, what we're able to do in the artisanal small scale space is actually de-risk investment into it. People don't touch artisanal small scale mines because there's extraordinary risk to doing so. And then you overlay
Mhm.
in Africa where we're operating at this point in time. And so we've started to build a platform that allows us to de-risk investment by using remote sensoring and artificial technology to identify. It's overlaying not just the identification of ore bodies and the cadastral data, but it's also looking at social issues and environmental impacts on the ground, using satellite imagery to then say, okay, in Zambia, where they're operating, we can actually see with this asset, what have been the environmental impacts over the last 5 years? What does water pollution look like? What does deforestation look like? Where is a mapping of clinics and infrastructure and roads, and education and schools, and then look at the actual asset itself. So our longer term goal is to build that platform out in its entirety that we can scale beyond just Zambia to say we can de-risk your
Yeah.
investment into this sector. And it will be necessary because it takes a very long time, we know, and a lot of capital to build a large scale mine. And we're able to do it in less than a year's time frame at far less capital, while addressing some of the largest
Cool.
social issues that exist today.
Which is just amazing. And I think the thinking through business models in a way where we sort of say, okay, well, what would limit this from working? And you talked about those aspects of the risk, the time it takes, that it's not appealing to be going down, one by one at that smaller scale. But we need people like you guys to be coming in and putting your expertise into figuring out how do we get those economies of scale and efficiencies of scale by pooling smaller groups together rather than just trying to build one big organization. I always find it fascinating when we don't think about the fact that even in big companies, so outside of mining, for example, in every big company, in their supply chain, are all of the small and medium and even micro businesses below that. And so I love that you're taking that approach of kind of looking at the system and understanding those parts, because I think longer term from a sustainability perspective, it's that type of approach that's just going to be critical, isn't it? I mean, things are just changing so much of how we have to operate.
Absolutely. And our goal is to create a very connected supply chain. So we've been using at a very basic level blockchain technology.
Yeah.
Obviously in Africa, working with artisanal mines, and many of them, the sad reality of it is, are not educated, and they wouldn't even know how to use traditional blockchain technology, but we've actually taken it back to, we are able to take imagery and weights and scales and use navigation to basically track and trace everything from source to refinery. And that's at the copper level. Gold is, there's a far less complex supply chain than what you get in some of these larger critical metals, for instance, that you're
Yeah.
large ore bodies like the copper. It's far more complex, but gold is a little bit more direct. And so our intention really is to be able to show through tracking and tracing where the gold on my watch is coming from. And I think that that's going to become very important, is to humanize the stories behind everybody that's involved in the supply chain. Because right now, a lot of people don't really understand the complexities of the supply chain. And then you hear about it, and especially when you talk about gold and gemstones and diamonds, and you suddenly start thinking about all the human rights abuses and child labor, like I've talked about
Yeah.
previously. But if you can just humanize the stories behind it, you can really, I think that there's a passion, there's a drive as a human being when you see those things. You can't not see something and say, "Hey, I need to act." It's like that is the automatic response when you see where your thing has come from most of the time.
And also, I think there's the element of the work that you're doing, which sits beautifully in the category of each person doing what they are good at, tapping into their own brilliance, their own expertise, and their unique experiences, rather than every single one of us having to become an expert on very complex issues. So when you talk about, a lot of those concepts you just rattled off around, whether it's child labor or environmental aspects or human rights abuses, it can be quite overwhelming, which is why I think most people end up ignoring it, because they're like, I wouldn't even know where to start. But I think the elements of, even when you talked about your three sort of pillars, and the mining and the marketing, and then the elements of around the community, it makes total sense that you are the right people to be doing that with your partner's decades in mining and your marketing, and then the work that you were talking about before, that has equipped you to do this. And I'd love for you to maybe just talk to us a little bit about how you weave together those aspects of, for both of you, at the level of tapping into your own unique brilliance, your own experience, to keep you motivated in what must be rather exhausting work at times. So that aspect of purpose and mission is important.
Yeah, it is. I would say, my background was not in mining. I did consult for mining companies for many years, but
Yeah.
from a technical operational point of view, that is, to your point, that is not where my area of expertise is.
No,
And I'd be BSing everybody if I said that it was, but I think that's okay, because you bring in
absolutely.
experts to do things that they are experts in, to your point. And so,
Mhm.
we saw this unique opportunity where there is an industry that the world requires. People don't like when I say that, but there is a dependence on mining at the end of the day. Um, but people often say, "Well, mining has a reputation problem." Yeah, it does, and it still has a big problem. Being on the ground and seeing the massive gaps that still exist and strides that still need to be made, especially when it comes to corporate social responsibility. It's taking that and then overlaying the fact that on my side, I've had this profound love for communities from the time I did my first pageant, and
Mhm.
people laugh at me and I talk about, world peace. But the reality of it is, like, I really was setting out to change the world in my mind at that time.
Yeah.
And I've done lots of work of building celebrities' foundations and then marketing them in such a way that, to, like I said, it humanizes what's being done by these figures out there in the world. And so we said, well, how can we marry those two worlds together? And very
Mm.
quickly it becomes so intertwined, because in order to do that, you have to understand at least the fundamentals or the basics, of what it takes to build a mining company, and what it takes to formalize an artisanal mine or a small scale mine, and what these communities are going through. So we've really embedded ourselves, immersed ourselves at a very local level in Zambia, so that not only could we understand, but we can marry those two worlds and tell those stories to the world. And so we've definitely stayed in our own wheelhouse, but I'll say, we've learned a lot. He actually has become somewhat of a good marketer, even, about each other.
There you go. You've rubbed off on him.
Yeah. And I think that mining in general it's a very complex industry. And, I'm learning every single day, if not multiple times a day. But that's the beautiful part. I think you have to keep that learner's mindset. And sometimes a different perspective is exactly what the world needs and what an industry needs and what a business needs.
Yeah, the sort of fresh eyes or a new perspective on it. And I would imagine that when you think about the business growing over time and what you'll be able to do, some of the issues that you mentioned before that can be quite frustrating if, for example, people are only looking at something as a marketing exercise or they're telling a good story, but there's not any depth behind it, rather than just complain about it, your work is actually doing something about it. So if a jewelry company then ends up buying through you, they can have the confidence that they can position their brand. It is traceable, it is genuine. And so I love that the very combining of your skills, the effort that you're putting into your business is directly then also making it possible for other businesses in their own supply chains to have more meaningful impact in the world, which is an extraordinary, if you go back to the legacy word you used, what a way to be having an impact in the world.
Absolutely. And I believe that the world will continue to evolve, especially as we near 2030 and we're still striving towards those SDGs to really demanding
Yeah.
knowing where things come from and knowing that it was done responsibly. And so I couldn't agree with you more. I will say, actually I'm here as in Zambia, but I'm currently up by the copper belt. And I'm in the process of doing some work with communities. We'll be distributing
Yeah.
fertilizer, but it's due to this lack of legacy that was left behind. When people talk about legacy, this community was relocated and they were only given enough fertilizer for a year, for instance, and so we met with them and
Mhm.
they said it's been a challenge because we were told we're going to relocate you. We're going to give you fertilizer for one season, but then the drought happened and they haven't had any yield. And so I always say, I don't want to be an activist, but I will absolutely give people a platform and for those that don't necessarily have a voice at a larger scale, provide a voice for them. And so, I actually did. I went and I chatted with this company to see what it was that we could do. And they said, no, our hands are washed. It was one and done. And what they said is it's bad for business to go back into a place that they've now left. And so, those are the things that
Wow.
I think that there's still so much work to be done when it comes to leaving a positive legacy in the world. And that's why I will, I think that we've got a great advantage by being a privately owned company at this point is I can
Mhm.
actually share quite vocally about my stance on things and the experiences that people have. And, I think I'll continue to do so because somebody needs to stand for those that can't stand for themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting because certainly my experience over the last few decades, so I had the privilege of being able to be part of and get visibility of the early stages in ethical investment that then became impact investment, and seeing the same waves happen each time. We might use a different word. So in 2000, when I was working for a short period with a group here in Australia that were in the ethical investment space, and everyone was saying, you can't possibly be making investments based on, your values and what you care about in the world and expect to make a financial return. Like, it's just not possible. And then, you fast forward a few decades and there's heaps of track record of that.
Mm.
With impact investment, and you mentioned the SDGs, there's again this push of, well, but businesses' priority is the maximizing of profit and you're being unrealistic. I've sat in this space long enough to know that it's just not true. And in fact, to be able to de-risk your business, the best thing you can do is have a much longer term time frame in mind
Mm.
and anticipate risk. Look more broadly at what we used to think of as externalities, like not my problem, those stories you just told of kind of going, we've washed our hands of it. those things come back and bite you. You know, when we talk about reputation, brand, the elements that over the long run will make our businesses flourish, you can't underestimate what taking the kind of approach you've been speaking about will have. And it reminded me, there was a piece you wrote about your kind of belief that the future is decentralisation. So some of these ideas of moving away from mass production, and you're demonstrating that in the mining space. But are there other elements that you've been exploring or thinking about in your own business that do sit in that category? I've just unpacked around the timeframes where you kind of see we're doing this community work now, and yes, it's legacy and it feels purposeful and meaningful, but also it's because strategically that is the best way to run this business.
Yeah, I mean, so I think mining in general, along with many other sectors, it's long dated investments and quite often quite capital intensive, right? And so when you think about from a risk point of view, a long dated investment, there's a lot of risk that can happen over a long period of time, right? And so how is it that you protect your investments become, I think, a big issue in an ongoing consideration that you just have to have, right? And so for us, and I talked about the social license to operate, and I get really upset when people say I'm doing this community work to protect my social license to operate, and then they stop operating there, and suddenly the communities just they fall apart because it was never done from an authentic place. And so that's why I think we're in a
Yeah.
beautifully unique position where we're looking at artisanal and small scale mines. Some of them have been formalized and licensed previously, and others have not yet because they just don't have that knowledge and they didn't have the capital, and we're bringing that to them. But you're building something from the start at a smaller scale because it's not as mass scale as you would see with some of these tier one
Mm-hmm.
companies. So the investment isn't as high. Number one, so it's not as capital intensive. Number two is it's not as long dated because you can turn it around far more quickly to be responsibly mining and ethically producing and commercially viable. But then, so that's on one side, but then the other side of it is we're addressing the community stuff at the outset. So, we're coming in from the
Yeah.
beginning before we even work with any of the miners to say, let's understand the dynamics inside of this community. Why are people mining illegally or legally, but at this small scale?
Mm.
What are the challenges in this community that is driving people to do it? What don't they have access to? And so those are the things that we're working in from the beginning, which I think it makes a big difference. It's like we're managing that, but the way that we want to evolve in time is that we are actually selling back the asset or providing ownership of that asset
Yeah.
to the artisanal miners. And so we've worked with a couple of small scale mines at this point where they still keep 10% ownership over their mine, because the idea is that they'll continue to
Yeah.
grow with us, their communities will continue to thrive with us, and that's how we're continuing to protect our investments, number one, but we're addressing at a very long period of time, long dated, how it is that communities can continue to thrive long beyond our involvement.
Which is so aligned with a more holistic approach to sustainability, isn't it? Because again, each player's engaging and bringing what they can at different stages of development. I think, as you said, if you just expected that every single small scale miner would be able to do what was necessary to build those things out, it just would never happen. But your approach where, uh, you're coming at this from the perspective of how do you very intentionally and carefully create that self-reinforcing loop where your business only grows and succeeds if they are growing and succeeding, means ultimately, you spoke before about wanting to de-risk investments. We've done similar things with different organizations, and you're exactly right that if you can actually build up the local people's engagement, skills, knowledge, and then ability to buy back the asset, you're de-risking any investment that's coming in. Because what are we all looking for as investors? You want to know, is there an exit here? And that exit you just described is the ultimate win-win, where it actually is lifting everyone in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've even looked as far as, okay, well, not just selling off, but, even diluting the amount of ownership that we have in
Yeah.
this investment. And so, I've always believed that you can turn mineral wealth into community prosperity. And I think, the sad reality of Africa is that there's been so much extraction out.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah.
and my vision is to change that. And, there's 45 million artisanal miners in the world. And honestly, if I could target 0.05% of that, that would make me feel really positive about the impact that Maker can have, because I know that it's a model that does not yet necessarily exist inside of the sector. So I believe in what we're doing, and I think there's a lot of potential to scale that across the region, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, and the beautiful thing is that even obviously we all hope that your model succeeds and you can scale and grow that yourselves. But as it does start to work, the truth of the matter is others will copy the model. And so you're right, that kind of scale and impact will have a ripple effect even beyond the scale that you as an organization have, because
Mm.
someone always has to demonstrate what's possible so others can follow. So it's exciting that you're doing that.
Yeah, and I think I've one of the biggest areas that I've seen over the last, I would say, 2 years since we started down this journey with lots of intentionality is a lot of people talk about it. There's lots of people that go to conferences and talk about it, and then
Oh, yeah.
you start asking them about, well, what are you doing about it? And have you ever been to an artisanal mine, or have you ever been to a small scale mine, or have you ever, and
Hmm.
oftentimes they haven't. And so, I think that there is this opportunity for people to move from just giving awareness and advocating for something to actual action. And that would be, my call to the world, and my request to the world is, how can you move from whatever space you're in, from just talking about it? LinkedIn's a great place. We all talk about things on LinkedIn. But how can you move from talking about it to taking action around it? Because that's actually what the world needs, is action.
I agree. You actually, the next question I was going to ask you was around that. So you've already sort of gone there around, for people who aren't in the mining industry or aren't in the same fields, what would your advice be of how we translate some of your learnings into our own work? But that's a beautiful way to put it. In For each of us as leaders in our own businesses, how are we stepping into that space? Because we all have that frustration of the people who are doing all the talking, but there's no depth behind it. Uh, my sense is that it's going to be those of us that are operating like you, who ultimately, from that positioning, branding, marketing perspective, when it's demonstrated through the long haul over time that there is depth, that there is genuine knowledge and understanding and expertise behind that, those things filter out. The people who are just doing a surface level marketing piece, eventually they're not able to answer questions, or they'll have a problem that emerges that they can't address as effectively or quickly as you can when you have your finger on the pulse and you're genuinely engaged. So I don't think it's our job as business leaders to spend all our time worrying about the people who aren't doing it right, but let's just get our own work, in line, our own ducks in the line, and be responsible for those things that are within our control.
Oh, absolutely. And look, it's not easy. I would love to just be like, it's been a breeze and this evolution has been wonderful. It's hard work, and it takes a lot of commitment. And I mean, gosh, in the last 6 months since being on the ground, I've gotten cholera and monkey flu and upper respiratory. And sometimes,
Yeah.
we look and we're like, gosh, you can't even, believe it's sad sometimes, the environments that you're in, and you feel helpless and hopeless,
Yeah.
because you're like, gosh, can we really make a difference? And it's not easy. But I will say, there is this commitment that we have, and that's become our driving force. And I see people across all sectors on social media that are talking, and they tell great stories. And if that really is your driving force, I would say, at least from what I can see in the world, you yourself are a leader in some way, and you have a responsibility as a leader. And it's like I said to you a moment ago, use that responsibility and start taking action around it. And I think that is all we can do. It's we can take action small incremental steps over a long period of time, consistency is what really is going to make the biggest impact.
I love that. And underlining and highlighting the piece over a long period of time. I think our time frames and having to see this as a marathon, not a sprint, will also be good for our own well-being, because if you're thinking it's all going to happen like that, you'll get demoralized pretty quickly.
Very quickly. Yeah, the instant
Yeah.
gratification thing that's happening in the world, we need to work on that a bit.
Are there any other elements that you would love to share with us, or that you think are important kind of closing out comments for business leaders to be thinking about or reflecting on the back of this conversation?
Yeah, I would say we sometimes get so just caught up in the day-to-day nuances of our businesses and on our lives and in our relationships that we sometimes forget truly all the challenges that exist out there in the world.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we can, when we think about some of these challenges, from climate change to child marriage to modern day slavery and trafficking, I would say I often relate to it, or I was relating it to it as like a, oh, shame, or like, gosh, that's terrible. But it actually looks down on a situation when you relate to it like that.
Mm.
And I think that there's an opportunity for us as business leaders, like I said, you've got a responsibility as a leader in the world, but to reframe and rethink about the way that we are relating to these issues. I think that there's a massive opportunity there. Number one, because once we can do that, that allows us to get into action, because you're just looking at it as something that is more from a solutions point of view as opposed to a challenges point of view. Um, and I would just say, gosh, we all go through stuff as well. So it's okay. People often say, gosh, you guys are taking on this big thing and it must be overwhelming. And, I could never do that. You don't have to do it at that scale. You can do it at a very small scale in your own place, in your own space. And I think that's perfectly sufficient. We all have areas around us and people around us that
Yeah.
need help. And it doesn't need to be going to Zambia or, going on the ground doing this community work. You can do something in your own backyard. And I believe that we all have a responsibility to do so.
Yeah. And I think the three kind of layers of the system that you've brought up around being conscious of how we're consuming, how we're manufacturing, and how we're sourcing, I think can be really helpful as practical entry points for us to think about how we're already spending money,
Mm.
how we're already doing the work that we do. And as you said, that looks different for each of us. But I think it is helpful to, in sort of wrapping up the conversation today, to remind people that even if you're not at the big end of town of like manufacturing is not your core business, or you're not in mining, we're all buying things to run our businesses. We all have computers, technology that have these resources in them. We're paying people and creating a culture. So using those levels of consume, manufacture, and source, and just reflecting on those elements of where can we start? What is an entry point? And you're right, we don't have to go from being in Perth to being in Zambia. It doesn't have to be that extreme. I think it's amazing and wonderful that that's been your journey. But part of the genuine kind of evolution and engagement with sustainability is for each of us to do what is most natural and taps into our skills and our passion and drive. If we are doing something because we think we should, or because someone else, that's their passion, the reality is you're not going to have the energy to stick at it. Whereas if it's coming from a genuine, connected place that's authentic, then you can do what you're doing, which is really putting your body on the line. You wouldn't have been able to stick at that very long, I don't think, if you weren't really committed. So um,
Yeah.
thank you for painting that picture for us and sharing what it looks like for you, but also challenging and encouraging us to think about it in our own work. Where is the best place for people to, if they want to learn more about your work or connect with you, uh, what's the best angle for people to tap into that?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, on LinkedIn, I love LinkedIn. I think that it's a platform that is growing tremendously, especially in the business
Yeah.
space. So definitely find me on LinkedIn. I'm not even going to try to bother spelling my last name for you here. So I'm sure you'll.
No, that's fine. We'll share it. Yeah.
And then also on Instagram, and on Instagram, you'll see far more of the personal side of me as well. I love to marry both worlds. I think it's really important. So that's at the official
Great.
Brooke. So that one's quite easy. But LinkedIn and Instagram would be the two places to continue to follow our work, because we're doing some really great things, and it's only going to continue to evolve over the next couple of years.
Beautiful. Well, we will share that. And just briefly, in terms of the the stage that you're at now, can companies already engage with you and be procuring through you, or can people be buying things directly from you, or you're still setting all of the pieces in motion?
Yes, they definitely can, with copper
Yeah.
specifically. So we have been working with large
Okay.
scale mining companies to build up and formalize small scale entities that are producing copper here in Zambia. And as I said, we are actively looking at gold assets at this point, and I'm really
Great.
excited about the development of one potentially. So we'll continue to share
Fantastic.
the evolution of that, and how to get that to Main Street consumers.
Wonderful. So if anyone's in those spaces, then it's always good to begin these conversations anyway, because it takes time to weave into people's supply chains. So I encourage people to connect with Brooke, and thank you again. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it was lovely to connect with you. And thank you everybody for listening on it.
Wonderful.